Hello and welcome. We've got a great guest today. We've got Jesse Mermell, candidate for the Massachusetts 4th Congressional District. Jesse and I have known each other for quite a long time, but I'm excited to talk about the race and talk about her views on it. And I'm sure I will learn something about Jesse. I'm sure you will as too. So thanks for watching Brookline Interactive Group Television, and we're going to just dive right in. Jesse, tell us about like the first, 30 odd years of your life. Tell us about what you were doing between birth and 2019.
Oh my goodness, that's a long story. First of all, hi Tommy, thank you for having me. Good to see you, and I hope you and the family are staying safe and healthy through all of this. I will spare you the early stories of that Little Red Riding Hood play I appeared in, but I moved to Brookline over 20 years ago. We met in those early days and have really spent all of this time fighting to create opportunity for people, right? Fighting for systems that work, fighting to make sure that people have access to healthcare and that people have access to equity of opportunity. Obviously I was on the select board in Brookline for 6 years. You and I got to partner together on some, really exciting grassroots local work on how you tackle the climate crisis at the municipal level. Served in Governor Patrick's administration as his communications director and had the chance to conceive of and lead his Strong Women, Strong Families initiative. I ran external affairs at Planned Parenthood for a while. It was during the heart of the ACA debate, so fighting to make sure that reproductive care was included as preventive care in the ACA, something that unfortunately the Supreme Court gutted last week. So I'm a little bit in my feelings about that, taking it a little personally since that was something I worked so hard on. And then after I left the Patrick administration, and spent the past 5 years running the Alliance for Business Leadership, the socially responsible progressive business organization in Massachusetts, working on paid family medical leave, earned sick time, investing equitably, raising revenue equitably, and then investing it in transportation and education and housing. Quite frankly, Tommy, the things that you and I both know, if we had put them in place in advance of COVID-19, our country would be in a heck of a better spot than where we are right now. And I mean that both from a public health perspective and an economic one. And, I moved to Brookline from rural Pennsylvania. I grew up in a small farming town and had a pretty typical, small town kid experience growing up, and came here for school like a lot of folks when I was about 19 and never left. Met folks like Phyllis Giller and the late great Pawnee Katz when I was 19 or 20, and they pulled me into town politics, got me to run for town meeting when I was 21, and managed to find an incredible home and some incredible like-minded progressive leaders, and a lot of us have been doing that work together ever since.
Well, yeah, I think that's exactly right. At least the parts about our shared experience. We're about the same age, and you started in Brookline politics a little bit before me, and I learned quite a bit from you watching you navigate the system as a young person.
I was very excited when you got elected to town meeting, because collectively we're bringing the town meeting age down big time. I don't know that we would quite accomplish that these days, but 16, 17 years ago is a different story.
It was exciting to be so young in a room full of people who, quite frankly, heard us and listened to us and embraced the ideas of some younger folks.
Most of the time.
And I don't know, maybe the U.S. House of Representatives is the same way. Maybe that's why you're running for Congress. But perhaps you've got some other ideas on how it is you decided to get into this race and why you knew it was the right time for you.
I got into this race to stand up to Donald Trump and his minions. I got into this race to fight for a healthcare system that people can access and afford. I got into this race to fight for reproductive justice. And back in October, when we launched, I was deeply focused on equity and creating an equitable 4th Congressional District, and never could have imagined that the things I was focused on, the things that I've worked on for the past 20 plus years around equity, would be as crucial as they are right now as we try to think through how we chart an equitable path forward coming out of COVID-19. But anyone who knows me really well knows that most important decisions in my life are driven by my grandmother, who sadly has been gone for a long time. It'll be 18 years this fall, but she was a remarkably civic-minded woman who, because of the era in which she came into her own, didn't have as many opportunities, quite frankly, as she should have. But she took all of her talent and her energy and she funneled it into civic life and really imparted upon me and my brother and our cousin that if there were problems out there, we had to be a part of figuring out how to solve them. It didn't matter if the problem was big or small. It didn't matter if our role in solving it was big or small. But if you think you have something to offer, if you think you can be a part of the solution, you've got a responsibility to step up. And honestly, for me, when I look at what's happening in Washington right now, and as I was making the decision last fall whether or not to run, it kind of came down to what my grandmother would expect me to do. You know, I knew she would expect me to roll up my sleeves and try to be a part of the solution, to take whatever muscle I've built here in this fight in Massachusetts for the past 20 plus years and go to Washington and try to right the many, many wrongs that we are experiencing as a country right now. So really, I know it sounds cheesy, and I'm not typically a very cheesy person, but to me, the why is very much rooted in Rhoda Mermell.
And I think it's important to help some viewers understand the timeline. You were in before COVID was a thing in China or in Italy. I mean, you were in the
October.
Race. You've been in the race for quite some time, and obviously the COVID pandemic has dramatically changed the way you and other candidates are campaigning. And we may have time to get to that. But I want to hone in on your experience at Planned Parenthood. You mentioned reproductive rights being one of the reasons you're running. As you know, in Massachusetts, there's conversation right now about the Roe Act, and I'm hopeful that we'll get that to the floor. You also mentioned the Supreme Court decision last week. So there's a lot going on there. Can you tell us a little bit more about your vision for reproductive rights and what that should look like at the federal level, and what your plans are to help get us there?
Yeah, my vision for reproductive rights and reproductive justice is that anyone who needs to access care can, and anyone who needs to access care can afford to do so, right? We know that reproductive justice is tied to economic justice and racial justice. We cannot move forward equitably as a country if we don't tackle reproductive health care. And we know that anti-abortion, anti-reproductive health care activists have been laying the groundwork for massive fights over the course of, quite frankly, decades. And what we saw in that Supreme Court case just last week that stripped contraceptive coverage out of the ACA is a result of all of that groundwork being laid. And of course, we had a win at the Supreme Court just a few weeks earlier, but it was based on technicalities. We know that those fights are going to come back to the Supreme Court. And Tommy, it's why the work that you're doing in the legislature to stand up for reproductive rights is so important. And that contraceptive case is the perfect example. Several years ago, I don't remember if it was after you'd been elected. Were you there for the access bill, or was that right before you? Right before you. So a number of activists in Massachusetts realized that threats were coming related to contraceptive coverage. They saw these cases working their way through the court and filed a piece of legislation in the State House that required Massachusetts insurers to cover birth control, so that if this happened in the Supreme Court, we would largely be protected in Massachusetts. There are a few loopholes, so it means we have to keep fighting. But by and large, we are in much better shape here than so many other states without protection. And it's because we took that proactive step. It's why the Roe Act is so important. It would do that for abortion care. And I know you are fighting that fight with some other great progressives in the State House. But my vision for reproductive health care in this country is that you don't have to do that, right? Because we are protected at the national level. It should not be an accident of geography. It shouldn't be because you live in Massachusetts as opposed to living in Louisiana or Indiana that you have access to a central piece of healthcare for any individual. So there's a bunch of stuff that we need to do in Congress, right? First of all, we need to codify Roe in federal law. We need to repeal Hyde. We need to support comprehensive fact-based sex education in public schools. Another thing I know is being worked on in the State House, but again, should not be an accident of geography. We need to ban the global gag rule. We need to make sure that Title X family planning money, which by the way, here's my favorite little fact, Tommy. The Title X family planning program was created by Richard Nixon. You know, that great champion of reproductive health, Richard Nixon. This was a Republican conceived program to invest in family planning because it's good for public health, it's good for the economy, and it's just the right thing to do. And what Donald Trump has done is taken Title X family planning money and put some of it in the hands of crisis pregnancy centers. These fake healthcare centers that oftentimes aren't even staffed by medical professionals and give people inaccurate information about their own bodies and their own options. And lest anyone think this is a red state issue, there are at least 3 of them in the 4th Congressional District alone. So we have a lot of work to do at the federal level. It impacts all of us, red states and blue states alike. And to anyone who's listening who cares about this, please, if Tommy Vitolo isn't your legislator, if someone else is, or to call Tommy and give him a pat on the back, call your legislator and ask them to pass the Roe Act. It is so important to make sure that we're protected here in Massachusetts. And then we're going to go out and do the work and make sure that everyone around the country is protected.
I'll say it's not work that I mind doing. And so while I absolutely hope that Jesse or whoever wins the 4th Congressional District is successful in really federalizing these ideas that Massachusetts is still hasn't quite locked down yet, but is working on, I don't mind working on it in the meantime. Jesse, you mentioned equity several times. And for those who pay attention to language, they certainly haven't missed our society's transition from the word equality to the word equity and the nuanced difference that really means. But I know you've been thinking about equity a long time. You mentioned it earlier. Tell us about an equity plan for the Congressional District, for the nation. How do we evolve the rules of our country and the expectations that we all have to have a more equitable society?
Yeah, I mean, how long do you have, Tommy? We got a lot of work to do. You know, I released an equity plan several days ago now, and it is long and it covers many, many areas of society because it has to, right? Because inequity is plaguing so much of this country. And the conversation right now is very rightly focused on what's happening in Black and brown communities, what's happening around law enforcement and policing and our prison system and the criminal legal system. But we also need to look much broader than that to really get this conversation right. So the plan that I rolled out absolutely includes pieces around, you know, just that, policing, the for-profit prison system and getting rid of that, the criminal legal system, supporting ending qualified immunity, something that the state Senate just voted to limit here in Massachusetts. And I know it'll be coming to your side of the legislature soon. You know, we need to make sure that the Justice Department is actually investigating the brutality in police departments, actually investigating and holding accountable when there are civil rights violations in law enforcement departments. We need to abolish the death penalty. We need to end cash bail. This is a lengthy, lengthy plan. I hope people will go to my website, jessemermell.com, and read through it and send me suggestions about what else we can do. But it also talks about the LGBTQ plus community and making sure that we're passing the equality bill. It talks about Indigenous people and making sure that we're providing adequate funding for healthcare and infrastructure. It talks about the intellectual and developmental disability community and making sure that we're fighting for fair wages so that people aren't being paid a sub-minimum wage for the work that they're doing. You know, it talks about supporting labor. It talks about supporting women. Because again, inequity is plaguing so much of our country. And I know that my job as a member of Congress, and I know this is how you approach your work, is to think about the question of equity in every single issue that crosses my desk. Transportation bill. Okay, let's read this. What are the implications for racial justice? What are the implications for equity? Oh, here's a housing bill. You got to ask those same questions. We have reached this point in our country of deep, deep inequity by choice, right? People have made choices over the course of centuries, over 400 years of our history, to build a country that in many ways is so unjust. But that gives us the opportunity to make different choices and create a different type of country. And to me, that is the small silver lining and the work that I'm very, very committed to doing.
Thank you. I hope folks will go to the website. I'm sure you'll tell us the website in a second. I'm not going to guess. I'll let you tell us. And then maybe you can talk a little bit about a federal perspective on COVID. The reality is it's not going to be gone in January. It's not. So if you're watching and this is news to you, pay attention.
Brace yourselves. Yeah.
we will still be dealing with COVID in 2021 in some way, shape, or form. And so the person we elect is going to have some role there. Tell us a little bit about your vision, maybe for what the federal government should be doing now, which gives us some insight, but then also what should the federal government be doing in 2021, and what would you be thinking about pushing on as a member of Congress to deal with COVID from any perspective that you think is relevant?
Yeah, for me, it's all about workers, 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 right? How are we shoring families up in the short term, keeping people healthy, keeping people with a roof over their head and food on their table? And then how are we, I always hesitate to say rebuilding, because it implies we want to go back to where we were, and we know that was leaving so many people behind, but build back in a way that is finally fair and just and inclusive. So obviously in the short term, we need to make sure that everyone has access to the PPE that they need. Frontline workers, doctors and nurses, sanitation workers, transportation workers, certainly educators, as everyone's trying to figure out what going back to school looks like, if part of it might be in person. We need to increase funding for testing and for contact tracing. I can't believe I need to say that out loud, but somehow it feels necessary with what's going on. We need to make sure that the federal government, again, short term and in the years ahead, is getting stimulus money to states and to cities and towns. There are so many conversations happening around the 4th Congressional District right now about what school budgets are going to look like in the fall. And I know that's tied to what's happening in the State House, but all of that is tied to the fact that a stimulus bill has been sitting on Mitch McConnell's desk for months that would have given $3 trillion in additional stimulus money, $1 trillion of which was earmarked for states, for cities and towns, particularly so that schools could shore up their budgets. So one of the things that the next member of Congress needs to do, in addition to getting rid of Mitch McConnell before even taking office, fighting to make sure that we elect Democrats in November, is to fight for that federal money to continue to go to states to deal with, to your point, the fact that this crisis will be continuing into January of 2021. And anyone who thinks a one-time $1,200 check going directly to workers and families is actually going to get them through this knows nothing about what it means to struggle and try to get by in this country. I support what Canada has done, $2,000 a month for at least 4 months, the opportunity to go beyond that if necessary, additional funding if you're raising a family and supporting people. And by the way, that doesn't just support the families, that allows them to then go out and support small businesses in the community and have that flow of money. So there's some really important things we need to do in the short term. In the long run, paid family and medical leave, right? Investing in clean energy, investing in public health, Medicare for all. These are the types of things that we need to do to build back in a way that is finally fair and just and equitable. Again, it's another area where there's a long, long to-do list, but that's the only alternative. We have to tackle all of it.
No doubt. I am going to, again, prompt you to tell us your webpage, and then maybe tell us about some of the endorsements you've gotten that recently have got you sort of really jazzed up, or demonstrate something about your campaign that you'd like us to know about.
Sure. Well, the website is just jessemermell.com, Jesse with an E, Mermell with 2 L's. And you can see it behind me in this beautiful artwork by a 5-year-old and 3-year-old supporter of mine. If you ever have the chance to see your name in taco stickers and googly eyes, I suggest you take it. It's pretty exciting. But yeah, I've been beyond thrilled by the momentum we've been building, and really the incredibly strong and diverse coalition that we've been putting together that is unmatched in this race. So to have the support of everyone from, former state representative Frank Smisek in Brookline to Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley, the State Council of SEIU, IBEW Local 103, the Coalition for Social Justice, which is a behemoth grassroots organizing group committed to social justice coming out of the South Coast, the Mass Teachers Association and the National Education Association. We are putting together a coalition of working people, of grassroots fighters who want to see change, not just here in the 4th Congressional District, but also nationally. It is a people-powered campaign. And I think that the reason we're building, again, the strongest, most diverse, most comprehensive coalition in this race is because I've been in the field doing the work with so many of these people for over 20 years. And they know that in me, it's not just a good vote. It's a champion. It's someone who will be a partner and who will do the work in community with them. And so I'm excited. We've got a little less than 7 weeks to go at the time of our conversation. I know there's a lot of hard work to go. I know it's a crowded and a talented field, but feeling very confident about our place in the race. And again, the support that we're garnering. And even if it has to be virtual, keeping our foot on the gas between now and September 1st.
September 1st, I'm glad you mentioned it. The election day is September 1st. You can vote by mail early. You can vote in person early. You can vote on election day. We're not going to run through all of those details and permutations now, but I think the legislature has worked hard to make sure that folks can vote in a way that's safe and comfortable to them during COVID, and it's so important that you do. We're running a little bit ahead of schedule, so I want to go backward just briefly. You mentioned both transportation and housing several times, and I know you've thought quite a bit about both of them and how they interrelate. And certainly MA4, right, ties in toward Boston, but it goes all the way to Fall River. And so the needs for transportation and housing are actually quite diverse in the congressional district and certainly the country. Can you give us a little flavor about what you think 21st century housing and transportation ought to look like? And frankly, what the federal government should be doing to get us there, since so much of that ends up being state and local decision making?
Yeah, it's really important. And I want to say thank you for presenting them as a pair, right? We don't talk about them in the intersectional way that we must all the time. And I know you and I share a particular nerdiness around transportation. The needs, but also the opportunities around those issues in the 4th Congressional District are vast. And I would be remiss if I didn't point out how closely they tie into public health and tie into our climate crisis, right? We can't address the climate crisis without also addressing transportation and housing. They all interconnect. I think the federal government has a huge role, both in helping to fund major projects like South Coast Rail, like fixing the Green Line, but also much less sexy things like our regional transit authorities. I mean, you talked about this district going all the way to Fall River. There are 2 regional transit authorities in this district, and for folks who don't know, those are the bus systems that go around in some of our gateway cities in Massachusetts. We have one in this district that goes between Attleboro and Taunton and the small communities in between, another between Fall River and New Bedford. New Bedford's not in the district, but we like them and we want them to have access to good transportation anyway. 25% of the funding from those regional transit authorities comes from the federal government. What if we invested adequately in the RTAs and in these communities where you have really struggled to have access to public transit? You know, the fleets aren't really electrified. You're not seeing schedules that work. You're not seeing stop locations that are actually convenient for people. What if we made the relatively low dollar investments from federal money in systems like that in order to create truly viable and green transit systems within those communities? What would that mean for access to different areas of housing that might not have been viable for people? What would that mean for access to jobs and healthcare and education? What would that mean for environmental impacts if people have a reliable opportunity to get out of their cars and use public transit? And of course, by investing in something like South Coast Rail, which is long overdue. I was on the state's Regional Rail Advisory Committee. We recommended moving forward with South Coast Rail immediately and not in phases. That would open up huge opportunity for housing for parts of the state that have really been left behind. And that's a two-way street, right? It means it's easier for people to get there and it's easier for people who live there to get into the city if that is where the job opportunities lie for them. But on a much smaller scale, we need to be talking about transit-oriented development, right? We know that that type of density and that type of strategic thinking is good for public health. It's good for the environment. It allows us to create more affordable housing, which is such a crisis in this area. And I think the federal government needs to look at the ways in which it uses carrots and sticks to encourage zoning changes, particularly in a place like Massachusetts, where we know that we aren't incentivized to think regionally. Right? Each community is doing its own thing. That's the way the system was set up. But sometimes, a place like Brookline needs to think about what its role is in the larger housing crisis. Sometimes a place like Needham or Newton or even Fall River needs to think about that larger context. And so I think there's a role in the federal government, obviously, in funding Section 8 housing, Section 202, making capital investments in housing, particularly existing housing stock to shore it up, expanding the low-income housing tax credit. All of those things matter, but I also think there's a strategic conversation to have about the zoning changes that'll be necessary to create a different type of housing stock, quite frankly, than what we've, by and large, not exclusively, but by and large, seen in our area. So that I could go on and on about this forever because I get very jazzed about it, but there are so many opportunities, big flashy things that would land on the front page of the Globe, and much smaller, much less sexy things that would still really, really move the needle for workers and for families. So I would be super jazzed to go to DC and work on this type of stuff.
Well, Jesse, we're just about out of time. I want to thank you so much for joining me today. I know you've been working hard at politics and at social justice and at making our communities better for over 20 years. And I've partnered with you quite a few times during that process. And
we have the battle scars to show for it.
We do, but small in compared to some of the real challenges ahead.
Yes.
I wish you the best of luck. I encourage folks to go to jessemermell.com. We definitely want folks to make sure they're voting on or before September 1st in the Democratic primary. And thanks for joining us on Brookline Interactive Group today.
My pleasure. Great to see you. Stay safe. All right.
Be well.